Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. If you want to turn your Bibles to Haggai chapter 2, that is where we will begin this evening in just a few minutes. Haggai chapter 2. If you would, bow your heads with me and we'll say a word of prayer before we begin this evening. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity here in the middle of the week to pause and be able to spend some time and study with our brothers and sisters. We pray the things that we study will, first and most importantly, be truth, that you'll guide us on the right path and you'll defeat us when we try to leave that path and keep us headed in the right direction, that you'll be with all the classes. Pray that all the teachers can present well the things they've prepared with the young classes tonight, with all the adult classes. Your will would be done in all things, that you'd be glorified. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So we are in Haggai chapter 2. There's only 4 questions from this chapter, and it's a relatively short chapter anyway. So I thought that we might take an opportunity to just kind of reset. I was hoping that would be easier to see. I always forget how far back you people sit, so it's a little bit hard to see. But if we just kind of hit pause on where we've been and where are we kind of in the timeline and what's happening. As you know, there's been a lot of debate and discussion about certain parts of the timeline, and we're going to get into one of those, and Roger and I already kind of discussed it between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of Ezra. There's a huge debate on what the timeline is in that area. But as we sit in Haggai chapter 1, we are all on the same sheet of music, which is great. It's somewhat unique that we all know where we are. So there's 3 passages that all refer to essentially the same year. Ezra chapter 4 and verse 24, Haggai chapter 1 and verse 1, Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 1. They all indicate that we're in the 2nd year of Darius, king of Persia. So we can be pretty confident. You know, we went up so many chapters in the book of Ezra. As we get to Haggai and Zechariah, we know exactly where they come into play on the timeline. Now, when we start talking about Esther and we start talking about Artaxerxes, the timeline gets really difficult. But right now, let's relish the fact that we can all know where we are confidently. Right now, we're in the 2nd year of Darius, and that is precisely where Haggai and Zechariah enter the picture. So, just as a little refresher on some of these names, again, just kind of a reset where we've been and where we are. The book of Ezra begins in the reign of Cyrus. And that's pretty well established, and it was his decree that brought the Jews back. Starting from Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1, Cyrus would have been king for about another 8 years. His son Cambyses would have been king for about another 8 years. And now we're in the 2nd year of Darius. And so we're about 18 years from Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1. If there's any questions or comments here, feel free to stop me. Just trying to reset. I heard something today that you don't absorb something until you hear it 5 times. And so I think y'all are smarter than average, so I'm only going to say this like 3 times maybe. But sometimes it takes a little repetition before we kind of remember some of these dates. So Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius would be the kings of Persia, and we are in the 2nd year of Darius. And history would tell us that means we're at 520 BC. Again, pretty uniform. Even secular historians, pretty uniform. Darius would have started about 522 BC. So we can with pretty strong confidence say that we're at 520 BC. 2 years into Darius. Remember that about 16 years ago, and we're going to get to that. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I'm sorry. So what has happened? Remember, this whole big project is about the reconstruction of the temple in the area of Jerusalem. So what kind of progress have we made now that we're 18 years into the book of Ezra? Well, if you remember, the altar of God was rebuilt. This altar was constructed, and the foundation of the temple was laid in Ezra chapter 3. And that was just a couple of years after the first wave of Israelites came back to Jerusalem, probably about 2 years after the book of Ezra started. And so About 16 years ago, again, as we sit in the book of Haggai, about 16 years ago, we built this altar and laid the temple foundation. Okay? And as Haggai, as we talked about in the first chapter of Haggai, what we've been doing since then, we've just been building our own houses and waiting for the right time. Right, Miss Carol? We've just been waiting for the right time to start to work on the temple. And we talked about all the possible reasons that might be the case. But we've been waiting. So, again, just kind of remember where we are. 16 years since the altar was constructed and the foundation of the temple was laid. And can you imagine walking by that foundation every day and nothing else being done to it? I mean, what would we say about a building today that the foundation was laid and it just laid there for 16 years? Yeah, those people ran out of money. Actually, that's exactly what we'd say, Barry. You're exactly right. And frankly, that may have been exactly what happened. These people built nice homes and they ran out of money. And didn't rely on the Lord, as we learned in the book of Haggai. But so that foundation has been sitting there for 16 years. So who's in Israel? There's some question marks here, but there's some we're very confident in. There's some that are question marks. We know who Zerubbabel is at this point. Again, this book could very easily be called Zerubbabel. He is a fundamental central character to what we're doing. He's the governor. Remember, he is in the line of who? David, which also means he's in the lineage of Christ, all right? Mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. So Zerubbabel is the governor. Would have been common knowledge that he's in the lineage of the Jewish kings, the kings of Judah. We've also, again, clearly established, we know that Jeshua is in Jerusalem, in Israel, traveled over with the first band. He would be the high priest in the lineage of high priests. Again, as convoluted and as destructive as the captivity was, this lineage of high priests is very well maintained. And we know that Jeshua is the high priest. We also know that he is related, a nephew or a cousin of Ezra. We can piece some Bible passages together to put that together. We know that Haggai and Zechariah are both in Israel. It's very likely that they came with that first wave of Jews. But pretty clear from both of those books. Again, they start prophesying at about the same. I mean, God sends these prophets literally within weeks of one another. So it's pretty clear that they came with that first band. Those guys are in Israel. And there's a couple other question marks. We hadn't really talked about this, but thought we might just mention it briefly. If you go back to Ezra chapter 2 and verse 2, as Ezra, or whoever, recorded this, lists many, many names of the exiles in Ezra chapter 2 and verse 2, there's two names that are very familiar to us. And most biblical scholars will tell you, oh, it's not that one. I always get a little squishy when somebody says, oh, it's just not that one, because you'd have to assume that the writers of these books were not trying to write them to be as confusing as possible. They would kind of want to be clear in what they said. And in Ezra chapter 2 and verse 2, it says that two of the exiles that returned, again, Zerubbabel and Jeshua are the first two mentioned, and then the third one is Nehemiah. And on down the list, you see Mordecai. There is a significant amount of debate about whether that's the Nehemiah from the book of Nehemiah. The conventional timeline would say, absolutely not, it's impossible, there's no way. I didn't want to get down that rabbit hole again this evening, but if you kind of believe or accept the abbreviated or shortened timeline of Ezra, that could very well be the Nehemiah of the book of Nehemiah, which would mean that he came with the original exiles and then at some point went back to Susa, where we find him as we start the book of Nehemiah. Again, that's not for sure, but it's very, very possible that Nehemiah, the wall builder, is in Israel with this first round of exiles. And the other one is Mordecai, which is really interesting. And again, the conventional timeline would tell you that's completely impossible. It has to be a different person by the same name, because the conventional timeline would say that the days of Esther are many, many days away, and this couldn't be the same person as the relative of Esther. I'm not as sure about that. It is possible in my mind that he was one of the original exiles that came back. I'd be happy to listen to other thoughts on that, but Again, if you kind of accept that abbreviated timeline of Ezra and that Darius is the king that's mentioned in all those books, then that very well could have been Mordecai. So I think that, I guess, if that's true, that kind of puts a little more meaning for me into the book of Esther and into the book of Nehemiah, to think that those guys could have been in this first wave of exiles and could have been hearing the prophecy of Haggai and Zechariah, and understanding what God was saying to that first wave of exiles, and how would that have affected their actions down the road. Okay, so don't want to get too far down the road with that, but at least I think it's interesting to think about who's with us as we sit in 520 BC in Jerusalem with the foundation of the temple having laid and weeds growing around it for the last 16 years. All good? Any questions on any of that? So that's only 2 times. So the next one, y'all, we'll have it cold, right? We'll have it down cold. We can draw the chart ourselves. All good? Okay, let's get into Haggai chapter 2. We know from the very first verse that we're in the same year here. Haggai chapter 1 and verse 1 says we're in the 6th month on the 2nd year of Darius. So we're in that same time period. The book of Haggai, and I should have mentioned this last class, the book of Haggai is divided into probably 4 major messages. There could be one more than that if you think verse 2 and verse 3 are different messages, but 4 major themes. And chapter 1 really only covers one of them, really the first message. And so we talked about the first message on Sunday. So let's start our discussion of Haggai chapter 2 with this question. So Haggai's second message is in chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. Can you summarize that for me? And then what would have been the purpose? So who wants to take a stab at kind of summarizing this second message from Haggai, verses 1 through 9?
Well, he's telling the people, he's including the people here in this.
Yes.
Not just Zerubbabel and Joshua.
So he's including the people, if you can't hear Carol, yes. The remnant, yes. Very good. That's verse 3, verse 2, end of verse 2.
He's telling them to be courageous.
Yes.
Get to work. Not to fear, that I am with you.
Yes. So the big picture message is get to work because I'm with you.
Have they already stopped again?
That's a great question. I think that leads to why this message. So it's a lot of the same theme as the first chapter, right, Carol? Is the first chapter was all about get up and get to work. But now here in chapter 2, and by the way, how much later is chapter 2 than chapter 1? Yeah, less than a month. 28 days, 27, 28 days. Because you'll notice in chapter 2, verse 1, now we're in the 7th month, the 21st day of the month. So we're like 28 days later. So within 28 days, Haggai is having to re-encourage, it appears, and I agree with Carol, that's very strange. He's having to go back and re-encourage, kick the people along again 28 days later. Why do you think, there's a little bit of conjecture, but I think we can certainly point at things from the text of why this might be the case. Why did they need to be encouraged again?
I thought it was because this temple, they didn't see this temple as luxurious and as stunning as Solomon's. Maybe those aren't the right words.
No, those are good words. So Ms. Carroll said, did they not see this temple as luxurious and, what's the other word? It's a good word. Stunning. As luxurious and as stunning as Solomon's temple. So.
Because remember back, they were crying.
Yes.
Both of them were crying.
Very good. So Ezra chapter 3 in verse 12, some of the older ones with the exiles, when they saw that original foundation laid 16 years ago, said they were openly crying because they'd seen with the first house. Why would, and how much could you get done in 28 days, first of all? So it's not like this thing's completed. For whatever discouragement they have, they're not discouraged over a completed structure for sure. This took 4 more years to complete. But whatever they were able to complete in the next 28 days, there was some discouragement about where they were. So this is a pretty simple question, but worth talking about. how much different was this temple going to be than Solomon's as far as the luxury and stunningness of it? What's that? It was not even going to compare. Why is that? What's that? They didn't have the money. Why was it going to cost a lot of money to build one like Solomon built it? I mean, you go back and look at the descriptions of the Temple of Solomon, it was like literally everything was overlaid with gold and precious stones and what's the terminology? It's like silver was worthless because there was so much of it just sloshing around in Solomon's day. So the nation was filthy, stinking rich during the days of Solomon, and everything was overlaid with gold. It had to be stunning. You can go down some internet rabbit holes on this, but like from the descriptions that are given in the Book of Chronicles, how much would Solomon's temple be worth? It's billions of dollars, based on the value of gold that would have been in that structure. I mean, I think it's probably beyond our comprehension how much, like what this would have looked like the whole building covered like, so much gold and stones. And now what have we got?
What they carried back.
I mean, just amongst themselves, right? They've had the labor force is a good question. I think it's interesting what Haggai said in Haggai chapter 1. Let's see. Verse 8. Where did the wood for this second temple, where does it start to come from? You would have thought Lebanon, and that's what they originally planned in Ezra chapter 3. Like remember we talked about they had it all set up to get the beams from Lebanon, whatever. What's Haggai say? You just need to run up and cut you some wood, guys. Like, you got to give up on this Lebanon thing. Like, well, I don't know where those beams went, but that was 16 years ago. And right, we ain't got any money now. It's like, just run up the hill and whatever tree you find up there. That's what, so I don't want to draw too much from that, but I think it's interesting what Haggai says there. Just go cut your tree and let's get started. And so even the wood that the temple would have been made out of would have been significantly less ornate and luxurious than Solomon's temple. So like even from the very first timbers that lay on the foundation, it would have been just evident that this thing is going to, with our physical eyes, this thing is going to be just completely inferior. So that's definitely part of the slowdown. It seems like they've been discouraged, especially the ones that can remember. And don't you imagine that the ones that can remember are spreading the word about what that old temple used to look like. What's that? I wasn't going to say that, Carol, but I'll let you say it. So sometimes we get a little rapturous talking about how good things were. And that certainly maybe was the case. There's also one other interesting note, and I don't know if anybody caught this, but is there anything significant about the date that's noted in Haggai chapter 2 and verse 1? Anybody have a note on that? Thank you. It was during a very important festival. So if you go to Leviticus chapter 23, that would be your verse reference. And then we won't take the time to go read that, but which feast would it have been? Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths. And so the Feast of Booths began on the 15th day of the 7th month. And now we're and it lasted for 8 days. So now we're in the 21st day of the 7th month. So depending on how the Jews do their math there, this is either 7th or 8th day of the Feast of Booths. And something significant was supposed to happen on the 7th day of the Feast of Booths. If you read Leviticus chapter 23, they were supposed to bring in all the produce, all of that year's produce. This is, on our calendar, this is September, October-ish. And so they're supposed to bring in all the produce that the land had brought forth during that harvest and have a festival. And it is basically a feast of praise to God for that year's harvest. That was a big deal on the 7th or 8th day of the Feast of Booths. It's exactly when this was written. Why might that have been a problem in Haggai chapter 2? The harvest, stinky. Yes. And yeah, maybe worse than half, depending on how literal you think Haggai's being with how many vats of whatever were left. And so this day that was supposed to be a great celebration of the harvest, what would it have been like? So again, we're supposed to have this great feast where we're bringing in this bountiful harvest to this beautiful temple, and instead we got 3 scrawny years in front of this foundation, and we don't even have the money to finish it. You can imagine how that would lead to some disillusionment and some discouragement. I don't think that the specific date here in Haggai chapter 2 is an accident. That there was a reason that God sent this message to Haggai on this specific day that he notes, the 7th month, the 21st day of the month. So I think that's interesting. Yes, sir.
I didn't want to get ahead of you, but also in this message in verse 9, while he said physically it's inferior,
Yes.
the glory is going to surpass the glory of Solomon's temple.
Yes. No, that's excellent. And so that's probably the most important part of this second message. One other thing I'll note before I get to there, and thank you, Roger, but I'll note in verse 5 that, and so why would they be discouraged? So we've kind of probably overanalyzed that. Why would they be discouraged? So what's the message? The message is pretty clear. Verse 4, be strong, get to work, I am with you. And specifically he says, according to the covenant. By the word of the covenant I made with you when you came out of Egypt. Some versions may translate that a little bit differently. But according to the promise or according to the covenant I made with you when you came out of Egypt. He references that specifically. Hard to know exactly what Haggai might have had in mind or what the people might have had in mind, but it was probably something very similar to Deuteronomy chapter 7. And that's probably worth going back to read. These passages that you probably will recognize when we read it. But Deuteronomy chapter 7, beginning in verse 6, and remember this would have been the second giving of the law after the people came out of Egypt. So as the covenant when you came out of Egypt, could this have been part of the promise that Haggai had in mind? Verse 6, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, not because you are more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, but for you're the fewest of all peoples, but it's because the Lord loves you and is keeping his oath that he swore to your fathers. God, you are God's people and he loves you and you're a people holy to the Lord. That promise that I'm sure in their minds would have been easy to think that God had abandoned during their years of captivity. God is reaffirming here that covenant is still very much in play. So to Carol's point about encouraging, hey, I'm still the God that brought your forefathers out of Egypt. You're still my people. Not because you're most in number significantly there, but because I love you. You're my people. Let's get to work. I'll be with you. That's kind of the message of the second message here. And then probably most importantly, the glory of this house, Haggai chapter 2 and verse 9, the glory of this house will be greater than the glory of the former. Again, if you put yourselves in the shoes of the Israelites standing around that temple foundation, that had to sound absurd. The glory of this house is going to be greater than the glory of Solomon's house. That is physically an impossibility. And indeed, physically it was. So what does Haggai mean here? That the glory of this house is going to be greater than the glory of the former house. Carol says Christ would come to that temple. Any other thoughts there?
Hebrews 12 links this together that
Yes.
it's a messianic thing.
Yes.
Because the third leg of the threefold oath to Abraham was that someone would come through his loins that all nations would receive a blessing from him. That's
Yes.
why that glory.
So there's clearly something in this passage that indicates Haggai's talking about more than just this physical structure. When he talks about the shaking of kingdoms all through that passage, verses 6 and 7, I'll shake all nations, I'll shake all kingdoms. To Roger's point, that's language that is almost exactly verbatim used in Hebrews chapter 12, when God says, once again, I will shake all things. There he's talking about literally the end of time, But that same language is often used to talk about the coming of a new kingdom, or the coming of a new leader. I'm of the opinion that this glory of this second house is just talking about this new second covenant when Christ as the bringer of that. That the Persian nation and all these other nations of men were going to be ultimately shaken by a kingdom that was going to be greater than all and over all the earth. Remember, he said the same thing to Daniel in his vision, that this last kingdom was going to be the greatest of all. But maybe the more interesting question, not more interesting, that's extremely important. An interesting question is, how would the Israelites standing around the temple foundation have understood that prophecy? It's unclear that they did. It's really unclear that Haggai even did. But just that God promised that the glory of this house is going to be greater than the glory of the former. Much like, Peter says in 1st or 2nd Peter that the prophets of old didn't really even understand the things that they themselves were writing. I think this is probably one of those examples. This was written for us to be able to understand God's plan. I think it's very unlikely that Haggai was able to put those pieces together. Oh, he's talking about the coming of a spiritual kingdom, and that spiritual kingdom would be greater than this old physical house. That's a stretch to think that would have been fully understood at that time. So anyway, first few verses of Haggai, in my judgment, are for New Testament Christians to understand for our benefit. Yes. Yes.
It's kind of foreshadowing here because he's telling that, this physically inferior temple is going to be filled with even more glory. It's kind of foreshadowing that it's not going to be something physical. But they didn't even understand that for many generations later.
Yes. And if you didn't hear that, even in Jesus' day, this idea that a spiritual kingdom was going to be greater than the glory of the past physical was not something that was understood. And honestly, if you just read Haggai chapter 2, I'll kind of give them a pass on a lot of that. If you're standing around that foundation and that is the prophecy that you hear, it's very hard to imagine that you're going to just think, oh, well, clearly he's talking about a spiritual kingdom that's going to come. It's not that straightforward. You can see why it took the apostles the time that it did to reason all that through and bring all that together.
Like in that verse 7, evidently there's a lot of Hebrew discussion about what that desire of all nations.
Yes.
We kind of look at, well, that's Jesus. How do they not know that? And then verse 9, the latter temple, to me, that's the church.
Yes. I meant to make that point. Thank you.
2,000 years later, I kind of get it. I don't know how those two guys at all.
Correct. Thank you. That's very well said. What I was trying to say is, the desire of nations, if you got the King James, that's what it says in verse 7. Other translations render that very differently. But the desire of nations and the glory of this new temple, again, I think that we can kind of understand what that means, but man, we're asking for a heavy lift to ask the exiles to fully piece that together. Somebody else have a thought? Any other thoughts or comments on the first message of Haggai there? It was definitely intended to be a mystery hidden in the ages, right? That as Paul would write to the Ephesians. So it's not intended to be straightforward. Now, could some of the most studious Jews have understood the import of this? Perhaps. I think it's very unlikely that most had any real idea of the way we would understand that today. What that's worth. Okay, let's move on to the next section, beginning in verse 10. So Haggai uses a metaphor in kind of verses 10 through 14, makes a comparison, and he asks a specific group about this comparison. Who does he phrase these questions to? The priests. Yeah, and so he asks him. So if you're carrying stuff in your garment, you got your garment folded up, and you're carrying something holy, and something else touches it, does that make something else holy? I'm paraphrasing here, probably butchering it. Does holy food make something else holy? No. Well, what about if you're unclean and you touch something else? Does that make something else unclean? Yes. And so, what is the conclusion in verse 14? They are unclean. So somebody take that comparison, that metaphor, and bring it to 2021 hillbilly for me.
They haven't made anybody holy by their presence, but they've been made unclean by the presence of foreign people before God.
Okay, so clearly in verse 14, the impact of this is they are unclean. Like their uncleanness has caused a problem. And you go on down in the chapter, I think it's pretty clear that their uncleanness has caused some of their economic issues. He makes that point pretty directly. But he says something interesting in verse, verse 14. And I don't know that this is maybe specifically talking about the altar, but remember, what's kind of the only thing that they've actually completed in Jerusalem, based on our timeline, is the altar. It's the altar that they built on like very early on. And they say, and Haggai says in verse 14, so it is with this people and with this nation, with every work of their hands, and what they offer there. Like mentally, I see him pointing at this altar that's standalone by itself because there's no temple around it. Like what they offer there is unclean. When they were offering something on the temple, when they were offering something on the altar, what was that for the Israelites? A terrible way to ask that question. That was worship, right? That was their worship. They were worshiping. They were taking something to the altar to offer it as a sacrifice to God. They were worshiping. So God is telling them, and very clearly through Haggai, that their worship itself, what they're trying to do to serve God, is unclean. Like it is like sin has completely corrupted it. It is unclean. Can you imagine if a prophet came to us today and said, hey guys, this is what you're doing tonight? Everybody coming in here to sing these songs and to read these verses, it is wholly corrupt. It is completely unclean. It is sin-filled. Like, what kind of impact that would have? Maybe we don't get the full impact of that. That's like a gut punch verse. If you are a Jew in this group of exiles, what you offer there is unclean. Whew, that's pretty heavy. Yes, ma'am.
Does he use these two examples? The first one was your sacrifice was unclean.
Yes.
Okay. The second one was they are unclean as a nation.
I think if I am understanding this correctly, and I'm happy to listen to other understandings of this, I take it to mean because of your lack of diligence toward doing what God sent you here to do, that sin has corrupted the whole nation. It's corrupted the worship. It's corrupted the people. It's corrupted the land. It's corrupted the harvest. Like sin has ruined everything for y'all, and you don't even get it. And so it's not like in my judgment, it's not like anything that they were doing in that specific sacrifice was not according to the law necessarily, but just the way they were living in general was making everything about the whole nation unclean. So if you had to summarize it, why would I summarize it? Like unholiness corrupts everything it touches. Like their unholiness of their life was corrupting their worship and corrupting their success and corrupting everything was going to pot because of they've abandoned what they were sent there to do spiritually for God.
Michael, this is basically what Jesus dealt with. Spoke of in Matthew 15. These people were offering lip service.
Yes.
And it's a simple concept: faith only.
Yes.
Faith without works.
Yes.
Is obedience.
Yes.
Makes faith worthless.
And you can almost, very good point. Yeah, if it's just lip service to God, or if it's just minimal service to God, I might say what they're doing here. But yeah, but hey, we're worshiping on this altar. God, we built this altar for you. We brought the animals on the feast day, just like you said. But their lives were certainly not in line with and their lives were corrupting everything they touched. And so a couple of verses that I just have in my notes that thought you might want to jot down there is make sure that we comprehend how, like, this is not just a message here in Haggai, but this is something pretty consistent in Scripture. Do we appreciate how much sin corrupts? If you go all the way back to Adam in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 17, like what corrupted the ground? It was sin that corrupted the ground. And in Genesis chapter 5 and verse 29, that corruption, like the ground still being unclean or corrupted, was still very much thought of in Genesis chapter 5 because Noah, his name meant one that might bring the cleanness or take away the corruption of the ground. Anyway, that reference is in Genesis 5 and verse 29. So sin had corrupted everything. And I don't think we kind of appreciate the corrosive, the corrupting nature of sin and what it can do, not just to our spiritual lives, but as it was to the people of Haggai's day, to their whole lives. And so the next question has to do with the end of that message. So this third message about the way that their worship had been corrupted, he kind of ends that message in verse, again, he talks about in verse 16 how they had suffered, I keep saying economically, there's probably a better way to say that, but they'd suffered, their harvests were poor, and their lives were difficult. Verse 16, when one came to a heap of 20 measures, they were 10. When you went to draw 50 measures, they were 20. There were blight and mildew and hail. Sounds like a miserable place to be. And he ties that directly back to the corruption brought about by their sin. But then he gives them a very specific circle the date on the calendar day. What was that day? 9/24 on the Jewish calendar. So I got a little bit of bad news. It was really December 17th. I got a very important lesson about the Jewish calendar. They didn't have September. So if you actually go back and look, when would this? Is he very disappointed? Like he looks genuinely disappointed. So just because I thought it was interesting, if you actually look at what day this would be on our calendar, the Jewish calendar, the months run very differently. As you may know, they kind of start in what we would call late spring. So the 9th month, the 24th day in the year 520 BC, you can actually go back and trace it. It would have been what we would call December 17th. So that's the date they circled on the calendar. Sorry, Dad. So they circled that day on the calendar. So why did they circle that day on the calendar? Things are going to change. I just think that like this is one of my favorite like messages from God. He's like, you can just circle the day on the calendar. It's going to be different starting. And I'm not going to tell you it's going to be different someday. It's all going to change. Like you just circle the day on the calendar, man. It's going to change on that day. I think that is so fascinating that he's that specific. And then he says, consider from this day onward. I think the wording here can be tricky. I want to make sure we're all clear on what this says. Verse 18, consider from this day onward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, since the day that the foundation of the temple was laid. What's he trying? I thought the temple foundation had already been laid. So what's he saying there? Okay, so there's one understanding of this that it means they just kind of completed the foundation on this day. So that is kind of one understanding. They cleaned it up and kind of completed it. Any other thoughts? Anybody see anything different on that?
Spiritual. I wonder if even if they had completed the temple all the way done by now, if they were still focused on themselves or saying, look what we built, if he would be saying the same thing.
Yeah.
He says, turn to me.
Yes.
And so,
very well said.
Not that their foundation of the physical temple was laid, but that they laid the spiritual foundation of repentance, of turning their hearts back.
The temple is always just a symptom, a symbol, a physical representation of their laziness and lack of spiritual effort. So it was never about the box. It was about what the box represented, that they just didn't care much about God's stuff. I'll tell you how I kind of understand verse 18 is Haggai is asking them to look both ways from this date on the calendar. At least, and I'm happy to be wrong. This is how I understand it. He says, so from December 17th, I'm going to use our words, from December 17th or September 24th or whatever day you want to pick, if you choose that day, how have the last 16 years been for y'all since the day the foundation was laid? Since the foundation was laid until this day I circled on the calendar, how's that been for y'all? It's been mildew and hail and pestilence and starvation. It's been pretty miserable, God, to be honest with you. So how's the last 16 years been? From this day onward, is the seed yet in the barn? Indeed, the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, the olive tree have yielded nothing. It's been a disaster. But from this day on, I will bless you. Man, that is good stuff. Like, even until this day, like they look on the trees, God, this tree doesn't look like it's going to be in great shakes this harvest either. There's nothing on this thing. There's no seed in the barn. What does that mean? They'd eaten the seed corn, so to speak. They weren't even left over to keep for planting. They'd had to eat the seed corn. Things have been pretty bad. There's no seed in the barn. By the way, I have no idea what it means to eat the seed corn. I just thought it sounded fun. Like I know what that means, please. I think I got a loose idea of kind of what that means. But there was nothing in the barn. But from this day on, I will bless you. Like literally circle the day on the calendar. If you start doing the right thing here, guys, this day on, I'm going to bless you. I just think that's fascinating. Okay, very last question. What is the prophecy given at the end of chapter 2? So now we're verses 20 through 23. Kind of a unique prophecy here. Who's the main character? Zerubbabel is the main character. And what is the message, or what is the prophecy about Zerubbabel? I know, right? It's kind of weird. So Zerubbabel is going to be to me as a signet ring. What was a signet ring? They sealed something with it. Was it important? How many of them were there? Yeah, there's like one of them. They didn't like pass these things out. The king had it, and that's how he sealed the decisions that he made. There was one of these. It was important. Real quick, because I think it's fascinating. Jeremiah chapter 22. Turn back there with me real quick. Jeremiah chapter 22. Verse 24. Jeconiah would have been the grandfather, I believe, of Zerubbabel, according in the lineage of kings of Judah. Notice what God says here in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 24. As I live, declares the Lord, though Coniah or Jeconiah, depending on where you see it, though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet ring on my right hand, I would tear you off and give you to the hand of those who seek your life. So Zerubbabel's grandfather, great-grandfather, would have been Jeconiah. And God says, I think so little of this king and so little of you people that if he were the signet ring on my hand, I'd take it off and give it to the Babylonians. As significant as a signet ring is, like this nation disgusts me to the point I would take the ring off and give it to the enemy. That is his grandfather. And now here, some 60 years later, Zerubbabel God says, hey, Zerubbabel, I know what I said to your grandfather Jeconiah, but you are my signet ring. I think when you put those verses together, that becomes much more significant. Zerubbabel no doubt would have known what was written in the book of Jeremiah, and now he's being told, you are my signet ring. I think that's very significant. So does this mean that Zerubbabel is God's chosen one, the one to come, the anointed one? Is Zerubbabel the Messiah we've been waiting for? Yes. So he's symbolic. He's a type. He's a figure of the Messiah that was to come. And this kind of reestablishes to the people that all those promises about the king that would come from David, those are still in place here. Zerubbabel he's still my signet ring. All those promises are still in force. And that's very, I think, very significant. Okay, so I know there's just a couple of minutes left. Haggai had 4 messages, and I thought it might be worthwhile as we conclude the short book of Haggai to just kind of recap what those 4 messages were. I hope you can see that. So first one, in the first chapter of Haggai, first message, arise and build. Your hard times are due to your unfaithfulness. If we had to just summarize it, shorten it down, that was the message of the first message. That was what Haggai said in his first message. Arise and build. Your hard times are due to your unfaithfulness. The second message in chapter 2, you're belittling this temple in comparison to the former. This one will be more glorious because peace will be available after kingdoms are shaken. You notice he says in chapter 2 of Haggai, the very last verse, that peace, how's it read? Verse 9, and in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts. I think that's a significant verse. So, even though it seems like this temple is less glorious, it will be more glorious. This new kingdom will be more glorious. The third message that begins in verse 10, you're not entitled to blessings because you built an altar and you make sacrifices. By the way, I think that's hyper relevant to our worship today. Just because we show up and sing, we're not entitled to blessings because you built an altar and make sacrifices. Sin has polluted your offerings and your harvest. Turn and see how God will bless. You can circle the day on the calendar. And then the fourth one, as we just talked about, God will shake heaven and earth and all kingdoms of men. Zerubbabel is a signet ring, or will be a signet ring, a type of the Messiah to come, and God's promise still stands. So those are the messages of Haggai, all delivered in the second year of Darius to these exiles in Jerusalem. Thanks everybody for your attention, and we will move on to class number 6 and get into the prophet Zechariah on Sunday morning.